Failure. It's a word that all of us are so fucking scared of, but it's a thing that every single one of us has experienced. J.K. Rowling, Steve Jobs, LeBron James, I mean, you name it, every single successful person that you know in your life has experienced failure at one point or another. And it's probably been a defining point of their career. So what if I told you that failure is not the opposite of success, but instead a stepping stone towards it? And it's not so much important that you're failing, it's instead important how you fail. Today, we are going to challenge the conventional narrative that failing is bad and explore how fucking up is the key to success. Welcome back to Organized Chaos. My name is Regan, and I am so very, very happy that you are here. One of the major misconceptions that I see around failure is that if I fail, somehow it means that I am less than. You'll notice this is a pretty strong theme in most of my episodes because it's at the root, it's at the heart of why we're so fucking afraid to do the things that we really, really want to do in life. It's because we're afraid that other people are going to put judgment on us, that other people are going to tell us that what we're doing is not okay. But it's up to you. It's not up to anybody else what you do on a day-to-day basis. But failure is a fickle thing. It makes you think that the value that you bring to the table is solely based on your accomplishments and has nothing to do with who you are as an individual. But the way I see it, the fear of failure exists for three different reasons. We fundamentally do not believe that we are good enough to reach the goal. We think that our success is only limited to achieving every single goal that we have in mind, which I will get to in a minute while that's fucking just not true. And then the third thing is you are convincing yourself that the stakes are far too high. You are thinking that there is a tiger hiding around the corner and you are going to get so unbelievably punished after every single failure that you have. But I am going to teach you a little trick so that you can start to flip that mindset around and start to understand that there is a spectrum of reactions that you are going to face when you do something that somebody else doesn't like. But let me start with a little bit of a personal story here because I have quite the journey with failure. If we are putting judgment on somebody, I was the first person I felt like people were going to judge as a failure. And it's fascinating because if I go and actually chat with people, if I tell people I felt like a failure in this, that, and the other way, the typical reaction that I get is, how could you feel like that? I've always viewed you as successful. And I don't say that to pat myself on the back, though. Yes, it is, I guess, a nice thing to hear. I also feel like now that I'm looking at it in a different way, I've been successful. But I tell you because it's so easy for us to get caught up in this cycle of, if I don't achieve my goals, I failed. If I don't achieve my goals, I failed, and I'm a bad person and no one's going to like me and I'm not going to have any friends and I'm not going to be worth anything and I'm not successful, which if you want to hear more about success and my view on it and how you can reestablish your relationship with success, go and listen to my episode from last week. But I have felt like I have failed so many times in my life. I thought I failed when I quit my corporate job because I had burnt out for the second time in my life. I thought I failed when I didn't succeed in the first 3 iterations of my business. I thought I failed when I almost failed my first year of university because I couldn't admit to myself that I was having such a mental health crisis and needed more help than I was asking for. And oh my God, I thought I failed during my divorce at 26. So there are so many different reasons and lessons in my life that I have learned, but moments where I have felt like this is a moment of failure. And now that I'm through it, I recognize that those were the defining moments of my life because it gave me the opportunity to do one of two things. It gave me the opportunity to make a choice. I could have run from the failure, hidden, and said, I'm not a good enough person. I'm now not even worthy of being in front of you. Or I could have turned around like I did and gone, what's next? And that what's next is the most important part of how you fail. Your ability, your resilience, the chance that you give yourself to take another step forward. You may not always know what's going to be next. It may not always be easy. Every day is not going to be easy, but you give yourself the chance to make a decision and propel yourself into that next phase of life. Had I not failed, I would have never discovered what I was looking for. Like, it was uncomfortable as shit. It was so not fun. But my failure, my falling, the mistakes that I made are the reason why I'm sitting in front of you here today. And sometimes you have to have that unwavering belief that your gut and your intuition are going to tell you the direction that you need to go. But in order to do that, in order to really confidently stand in front of yourself and say, I trust you, you need to recognize that failure is a part of this process. It's so natural to want to avoid failure though, because of course you're afraid of what other people think. Society thrives off of it. Corporate culture thrives off of being afraid of what other people think because it means that you sit within their confines. It means you sit within their lines and you want to climb their hierarchy in the way that they define it. But when you avoid failure, when you avoid doing something, quote, wrong, now there are different spectrums of failure, which we're going to talk about here in a minute. But when you avoid a specific kind of failure, you are pushing away the opportunity for self-discovery and even achievements and accomplishments in the future. But when you start to learn the right way to fail, that's when you are going to start to decrease the fear. So how do you fail the right way? That's the big question here. And I've learned a lot from Amy Edmondson. She is a professor at Harvard Business School, and she studies psychological safety, which I love talking about psychological safety. She studies psychological safety, organizational learning, teaming, and she wrote a book, The Right Kind of Wrong, The Science of Failing Well. She lays out 3 different types of failure. There's basic failure. So those are simple little errors that have led to a mistake. Those are an accident. So that's like doing a math problem wrong. That's a basic form of failure. It was an accident. You probably could have prevented it, but that's okay. We move on from it. The second type is complex failure. This is not always your fault. It's multiple different aspects have all lined up to the perfect storm. One thing and another thing and a third thing had to go wrong in order for this mistake to be made. Intelligent failure, though, is what we want to strive for. That's where new knowledge comes from. And that's why I say that being afraid of failure means that you're never going to discover something new. It's going to be very hard for you to discover something new. And failure can be perceived in so many different ways. Think about the last time that you received feedback. Some people view feedback as failure, right? Like you've made a mistake and someone is saying, hey, you need to do this differently, that differently, or this. Instead, I want you to take a look at feedback as an opportunity for you to dig deep into your courage and ask yourself whether or not you agree with this piece of feedback and what you can walk away and learn from it. Because that's what we should be focused on. When you get feedback from somebody, hey, I didn't like that you did this. I want you to ask yourself first, before you react, do I agree with this? I get feedback all the time. I get mean comments all the time. And I sit and I do this myself. I sit and I go, I got a comment the other day saying I was an idiot. I don't know why someone said that, but they did. And the first thing I asked myself was, do I believe that I'm an idiot? No. So that's not feedback that I want to take into account. That could have been a failure, but then I would have been putting the judgment entirely on somebody else's plate instead of my own. And so that's a piece of feedback that I chose not to take. There are other kinds of feedback that I absolutely will take into account. Hey, I didn't love this email that you sent. I didn't love how we had this conversation. I feel like you talked in this particular way and I would have liked that to change. Absolutely. Let's have the conversation about it. Because intelligent failure, that is where the new knowledge and the discovery comes from. If you think about scientists or researchers, they do this every single day. They start out with a hypothesis and they constantly fail. They have no idea if they're going to prove their hypothesis. They feel like they're right. They've done their due diligence, but they're constantly working towards an answer that is not confirmed. If you find yourself getting so nervous about failure, so scared of failing, the next time that feeling of dread comes over you, I want you to start to ask yourself a series of questions, very similar to what I do when I get comments that don't feel so great and my body starts to perceive it as failure. First, you can ask yourself, do I agree that this is failure? Or is this just my system reacting in a way that maybe I wasn't prepared for? Or somebody else reacting in a way that I wasn't prepared for? The second question is, what do I want to do? Like, what is my purpose here? Why did I make that decision in the first place? What do I know and what don't I know? So where's that knowledge gap? Because typically failure comes from you just not knowing that something was going to happen. If you think about early on in your career, you made mistakes all the time, which meant that you were able to get better. Because as people were pointing out your mistakes, you've probably started to make changes so that those things wouldn't happen again. The crux of it, though, is to take a look at the future, is to sit in the future and say to yourself, what can I try next? What can I try to do in order to improve the situation that I'm currently faced with? But I can totally understand that when you are faced with failure, when you feel like you're faced with a mistake, it can be so fucking scary. Your brain can start to convince you that you are unsafe. And that's the first step in how to cope. You need to convince yourself, you need to remind yourself that this is a safe environment for you to be in. Remember what I said earlier on? You think that the stakes are way too high. Remember, not all mistakes are made the same. There's a spectrum here. Some mistakes are so much smaller than others. And you need to sit and say to yourself, how do I believe this mistake stacks up against the rest? Objectively, how do I believe that? Because if we just assume that we are going to get yelled at, screamed at, someone's going to fire us for making a super tiny mistake in an email, well, that's an incredibly psychologically unsafe place for us to be. While sometimes the onus is on the company to make sure they're building a company culture that is psychologically safe, other times it's on us. The onus is on us to make that decision and say, how am I perceiving this? Is this the actual way that I believe it should be perceived? Because rationally, what is at stake here? If you have misspelled something in an email, your job is not at stake. Most of the time, the mistakes that we make, someone is going to laugh or disagree with us. And when we can start to put that in perspective, it means that we can start to take those steps, no matter how small, in that direction, knowing that the biggest thing that could happen is someone laughs or disagrees with us. And from that laughter or that disagreement, we can learn a huge amount as long as we can start to ask why. And failure used to scare the absolute shit out of me because I thought it defined so much of who I was. But by actually starting to ask why, by starting to question, by starting to objectively think about whether or not I agreed with a piece of feedback that was given to me, it helped me start to redefine my relationship with failure because I almost separated myself from that piece of feedback. Because often I think about failure as being equal to feedback. People use the word failure, but it's so intense. I love the way Simon Sinek talks about failure when he says that there's this spectrum and not all failure is created equal. So we need to avoid devastating failure, right? But every single time you make a small mistake, he calls that falling, and I'm going to call it feedback. I don't think we should run away from this concept of making mistakes. I think we should look at it as a chance to learn something more, to connect with ourselves, and to understand the opinion that we have in comparison to the opinion of others. But in order to tackle this fear of failure, you need to start to build your self-confidence. I've had to do a ton of work over the last couple of years building my self-confidence. And if you've followed the podcast for a while, you will know that this has been a constant struggle for me. But I've looked at it as an opportunity to start to close the knowledge gap because this fear of failure was holding me back. It wasn't allowing me to stand up in meetings and say, I agree with this, I don't agree with that. It wasn't allowing me to sit in on feedback conversations and objectively think about it. And instead, my self-confidence was taking such a hit because I felt like my worth was tied to every single achievement and accomplishment that I had. It wasn't allowing me to take a look and say, wow, that didn't work out, but now I'm going to move on to this new path. Now I'm going to change direction. Now I'm going to be pushed towards another area and see that as an excitement and something to celebrate because I was so afraid that other people would see that as a point of failure. And now, years down the road, my response to that is that's up to them. Like someone else's judgment is up to them and it's not up to me. What is up to me is to define my response to my own mistakes. But people are going to have their own response to mistakes every single day of the week. Often that says so much more about them than it does about you. The final piece of how to cope is make sure that you are surrounded by the right people and on the right team. Because while most of this is about what's going on up in our head, right? Like the way that we view failure is really based on how we are perceiving it, the way that we grew up. Like it's not your fault. It's the family that you were born into. It's the experiences that you've had, but it's the reality of the situation that oftentimes those experiences dictate how we view failure in our levels of self-confidence. But in almost equal part, it's important that you surround yourself with people who are going to support your ability to fail safely. There are some teams that are so psychologically unsafe that they create a hostile environment around anybody who fails. And I've definitely been on teams like this in the past, where if you make one mistake, nobody is willing to teach, and instead they shame. Now, many times they shame because they're projecting, they're afraid of failing themselves because they are tying your two personalities together far too much and making it as though your failures are their failures. But if you find yourself in a position where you feel psychologically unsafe at work, it might be time to either have a conversation with someone on your HR team or find a new team. Because I promise you, those psychologically safe teams exist. The best teams that I have ever been on are the ones that allow me to brainstorm and throw out the silliest ideas without fear of retribution, without fear of my promotability going down the tank, without fear of looking stupid, because that's where the best ideas come from. That's where creativity comes from. When you start to shame people for having a silly idea, you eliminate any form of innovation. Innovation dies in the face of shame. And failure oftentimes gets dominated by that shame. So instead, if you are not on a team that is psychologically safe, I want you to think about how you can start to transition to one that is. And if that's impossible for you right now, I want you to start to think about how you can be the light at the end of the tunnel for the other people on your team who are also in that psychologically unsafe situation. Because sometimes the change can be made from you, yourself, either by leaving the team or making the change within. And so you can make that decision for you depending what is the best thing for you at this particular moment in time. As we get to the end of the episode, I really want you to think about your relationship with failure. I want you to embrace it. I want you to learn from it. I want you to let it become a driving force in your career journey. I want you to accept it, to understand that it's such an important stepping stone and it's a learning opportunity for you at every single point of your career. The only real failure is letting the fear consume you to the point where you refuse to take any steps at all. Now, if you're looking for some homework, as we always have at the end of our episodes, here's something I want you to noodle on and think about. Start to conduct experiments with yourself of where you can fail safely, of where you can start to make mistakes. Maybe that's throwing out a new idea in a meeting. I met somebody in my early days at Google, and she gave me a great piece of feedback that I will take with me through the rest of my career. And her feedback was, try to say something in every single meeting. Don't say something just for the sake of saying something, provide value, but try to say something. And for me, that used to be as small as, good morning, everybody. And sometimes it was as big as pitching a new idea or a new project or taking responsibility for something else. But actively participating in every single meeting and every single call and every single conversation that you are in means that you start to build that self-confidence. You start to build that resilience within yourself that you can take on whatever challenge comes your way. And by showing your brain that you are safe in these situations, you're going to stop or at least reduce the amount of exaggeration and overestimation of like the terrible things that could fucking happen to you if you do something wrong, because your brain is going to be shown that it's actually safe, that people still like you, that people still love you, that people still want to work with you, that your promotability isn't impacted. And you know what? If anything goes wrong, use that as a learning opportunity in and of itself. Use that as a chance for you to be like, I did not feel psychologically safe there because someone left, someone made me feel bad. Maybe it's time for you to move teams. Maybe it's time for you to employ all the other tips and tricks that I offered up earlier on in this episode. But at least by starting to conduct these safe experiments, you are giving yourself the chance to prove to your brain that you are safe and you are okay and you can take care of yourself, or that failure is a good thing, that there's so much to learn from it. That's how I'm going to finish today's episode. This has been another episode of Organized Chaos. Thank you so very much for being here. I cannot wait to see you all again next week. If you have any questions, please let me know in the comment section below. I would love to hear from you all. Otherwise, I will see you next week. Thanks, everyone.